absolutely love big franchise blockbusters, but even the best franchises have some of the worst movies. So today we're going to look at the worst movies from the best franchises. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share some of your picks for some of the worst movies from some of the best franchises. My list is the right list. It's just my list, and I would love to see yours. One more thing before we get started. This video is brought to you by my supporters over on Patreon. Each month, they pick a video for me to do, and this month, they picked the worst movies from the best franchises. On Patreon, I do a weekly Q&A with my supporters over there. There's exclusive videos, there's early releases, a bunch of stuff. If you like my main channel, please consider supporting me over there. And there actually is a companion video to this video over there with 10 more of the worst movies from the best franchises. With that said, let's get started. Let's kick things off with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and we're going with Thor: The Dark World. For over 10 years, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been a critical darling and has just been raking in money, generating hit after hit, and generally speaking, the movies are very well received with only a few exceptions, one of them being Thor: The Dark World, a movie that, when compared to most of the other movies on this list, isn't actually that bad, but when compared to the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is bland, forgettable, and fairly incoherent. But here's the magic of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This movie is still fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. Its score isn't even all that bad, so when it first came out, people didn't actually hate this movie. Just by comparison to all the other movies in the franchise, it looks really bad and doesn't leave a particularly good taste in most people's mouths. Next up, The Wizarding World with Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald, a movie so obsessed with setting up sequels and shocking the audience that it forgets to tell a compelling, coherent story. All throughout the film, it sets up plot threads that go unresolved or lead absolutely nowhere. There's a bunch of misdirects where you think there's going to be some big payoff to this subplot that they keep explaining things about. Nope, it goes absolutely nowhere. But then plot threads that nobody cares about whatsoever, characters that no one is interested in, suddenly have a big twist reveal and are tied to one of our favorite characters in the Wizarding World in ways that make absolutely no sense. Continuity is thrown out. Characters show up just so we can go, hey, look, it's that person from Harry Potter.
Not impressed.
So I can only imagine how much more so actual Harry Potter fans were as they watched them just kind of tell this story for the purpose of milking out another spin-off and setting up a bunch of sequels that no one actually wants. Then we have the James Bond franchise, and I'm going with A View to a Kill, the final James Bond film starring Roger Moore. Now, in general, I'm not a biggest fan of the Roger Moore era of James Bond in general because they just went too campy for my taste. But this one just layers the campiness on top of a James Bond who is 15 years too old to be playing the part. When the movie came out, he was 57 years old, and they didn't adjust the story, the action, the plot line, the Bond girls, or anything to the fact that he was nearly 60 years old. Instead, they just caked him in makeup and pretended he was just as cool and good looking as he ever was and able to pull off all the stunts.
You've made a huge mistake.
And it's a shame because the main villain is Christopher Walken, Grace Jones makes an appearance, Dolph Lundgren has a small part in the film, but they were stretching his era thin, and he was way too old to be playing this type of Bond. For the Spider-Man franchise, I'm going with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, a classic example of a movie with too many cooks in the kitchen, throwing too much stuff in there, and eventually it led to the studio just cutting the movie to pieces and releasing a film that had lost all of its heart. Infamously, a couple months after the movie came out, Andrew Garfield was very open in some interviews where he said that they just started cutting character moments, removing little pieces, and by the time it hit theaters and what we saw lacked the heart of what excited him about this project in the first place. And instead, you get kind of a plot that hops around to a bunch of places, sets a bunch of stuff up for sequels and spin-offs. It answers questions about Peter's parents that we weren't really asking. And the central elements that really kind of worked, Peter's relationship with Gwen and as well as with Osborn, those just feel much thinner than they should be and feel like they're hopping around a little bit because it got cut to pieces.
Oh, that didn't work.
Likewise, it's well known that they cast Shailene Woodley as MJ, cut her out of the movie. And so you have a film that maybe in its original form, or if they'd trusted Mark Webb to tell the story he wanted to tell, would have been really good. Because when he gets to do his thing, it actually really works. But the story as a whole is all over the place. It's choppy, and I don't think it works very well. Next up, the Jurassic Park franchise, and I'm going with Jurassic Park 3, a confusingly bad film because on paper, this should be a much better film than it is. Right off the bat, they got Joe Johnston to direct it. He's a great pick to direct a Jurassic Park film. They got Sam Neill back as Grant, and we're heading off to an island for an adventure with dinosaurs. What could possibly go wrong? Well, apparently, they were never able to finalize a script that everyone was actually excited about, so they went into production without a complete script and had to just make as basic and straightforward as a plot as you can imagine.
Not a great plan.
So all of the interesting ideas about science and man, the nuanced characters, the complex plotting of the original, thrown out for a very basic rescue plot line about this family that's not interesting or remotely likable. And if the dumb plot wasn't bad enough, they also throw in a dream sequence where a raptor talks.
Alan.
So a movie that, despite having a great director and the fun cast involved, it's really bad. For the Batman franchise, of course, we're going to go with Batman and Robin, one of the most infamous franchise killers of all time. What I think is interesting about this film is that I think Joel Schumacher delivered the movie he wanted to make. He just made a movie no one else wanted. It's jam-packed with corny one-liners and puns.
7 million. Never leave the cave without it.
It's over the top in its design. It actually executes this vision pretty well in a lot of ways. It's just the version of Batman that's I'm not really sure who it's targeted for because it has juvenile humor while also doing close-up shots of butts and boobs as people put their costumes on. This movie was so off-putting to the general public that it killed all of their plans for a 5th movie in this franchise. Oops! They took 7 years off before they brought in Christopher Nolan to reboot the entire thing with a radically different tone that abandoned everything that Joel Schumacher was trying to do and instead to make it much more grounded and realistic. And as it turns out, that's what people actually wanted from a Batman film. Then we have the Indiana Jones franchise, and of course I'm gonna go with Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. The original trilogy of films from the 80s are some of the absolute best adventure films of all time. For my money, all 3 of the 80s films are great in their own way. And then for nearly 20 years, they were trying to get a 4th film made, and they could never quite pull it together. Names like Frank Darabont and M. Night Shyamalan were involved in the process at different times that were courted to write the script to try and make it happen, but they just couldn't see eye to eye on what they wanted to do, largely because George Lucas wanted to make a movie heavily inspired by 1950s alien invasion movies, and everyone else wanted to make an Indiana Jones movie.
I got a bad feeling about this.
So eventually they kind of compromised and they made a movie that felt and moved like the old Indiana Jones films, but at its core was an alien plotline, and it doesn't really work all that well. Now, granted, I think the movie gets a little bit too much hate where people don't appreciate some of the things that do work. When they do practical stunt work, I think it's actually pretty cool and fits nicely with the rest of the films, but far too often they rely on green screen, CGI, and it just doesn't feel like it fits with the other movies. There's some corny humor that doesn't work. Shia LaBeouf starts swinging with monkeys. And when you move into the final act and it's like full CGI, spinning stuff, aliens showing up, torching people, it just feels so far removed from what we got back in the 1980s that it doesn't feel part of the same franchise anymore. Real quick, before I dive into the final three on here, be sure to let me know your picks down below in the comment section. What do you think are some of the examples of the worst movies from some of the best franchises? Also, remember, there is a companion video to this over on my Patreon page with 10 more examples of the worst movies from the best franchises. So if I didn't touch on some of your favorite franchises, they might be over in that companion video. Join at any level and you can get that video and so much more. Moving along to a little bit of horror with the Halloween franchise, we've got Halloween Resurrection. Now, the original Halloween was one of the films that kicked off the slasher craze of the 1980s, and the franchise is still going strong to this very year, where we are waiting for Halloween Kills later this year. But about 20 years ago, we got a horrible addition to this franchise for basically every possible reason. Right off the bat, it commits the ultimate movie sequel sin by undoing all the victories and successes of the previous film, but really it undoes all the successes of the Laurie Strode arc over the previous 20 years in the first 15 minutes of the film. And it doesn't do this to set up a compelling story. It does it just to have an excuse to tell an unrelated story that could be any random horror slasher film. They just decided to convert it into a Halloween film about a reality show at a house where a killer just happens to show up. From there, you have Busta Rhymes using his martial arts skills on Michael Myers. I mean, it is a disgrace to the franchise with what they do in the first 15 minutes, followed by a bad movie and just a real stain on this franchise. For our next to the last one on here, we're going with the Middle-earth franchise and The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies. Now, I think there was always a problem in this franchise in that they took what was, relatively speaking, a short book aimed at younger audiences and attempted to convert it into a Lord of the Rings epic. And in doing so, they just simply did not have enough source material to warrant telling a story of this magnitude over the course of 3 different films. So by the time you get to this film, you get to a section of the book that's only a few pages before Bilbo is knocked out, and then they turn it into a 90-minute battle. And I think inherently when you do that, you don't tell a compelling story because there's just not enough there to sustain it. Beyond that, the action gets so fantastical and over the top that it just starts to look like a video game with characters running on bridges that are collapsing and flying all around everywhere. There's nothing about it that's grounded in reality. I understand it's a fantasy movie where magic takes place and there's all these mythical creatures, but you have to have something to ground it in a reality that at least has some set of rules, and this movie kind of abandoned all of that. So they started with too little source material, stretched it out way too long, and then went way over the top with the action, and it did not end this trilogy remotely as well as Return of the King did with the Lord of the Rings films. And finally, we have the Star Wars franchise, and this is a bit of a tricky one because there's several different directions you can take this one. I think the worst character assassination takes place with The Last Jedi and what they did with Luke Skywalker. The Clone Wars is barely a movie. They just edited together 4 episodes. It's basically a theatrically released marketing gimmick, but the movie I'm gonna go with is Attack of the Clones. It's basically a bad mystery tied together by even worse romance and exposition. And bad exposition that doesn't even entirely make sense. Beyond that, you've got Hayden Christensen trying to deliver these George Lucas lines, and it does not work. So they end up taking one of the greatest cinematic villains of all time, and suddenly we have him turning into a whiny hormonal teenager whining about sand.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating.
For me, this is the one that simply does not offer anything of value, and it takes out Anakin Skywalker as an interesting character for me. So it's my pick for the worst of the Star Wars movies. And like I said, there's several directions I could have gone with this great franchise. If you enjoyed this video, remember there is a companion video to it over on my Patreon page with 10 more of the worst movies from the best franchises. Join at any level and you can unlock that video. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.